We begin in 1991, the year of the fall of the USSR. The former socialist republics declare their independence, including Ukraine, where, during a referendum, 92.26% of voters are in favor of independence. The following years, numerous agreements are signed to establish a new balance in the states of the former USSR. In 1994, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan sign an agreement with Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom to dismantle their Soviet-era nuclear arsenals still present on their territories. In return, the three nuclear powers commit to guaranteeing respect for the independence, sovereignty, and borders of the three states. 3 years later, Russia and Ukraine agree on the share of the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet. Russia recovers 81.7% of the armaments and the authorization to use the strategic port of Sevastopol until 2017, in exchange for which it will pay Ukraine a total of $2.5 billion over 20 years. 3 days later, a friendship treaty further strengthens the link between the two countries, which commit to mutually respecting borders and territorial integrity. In 2003, Russia and Ukraine also draw closer to Belarus and Kazakhstan to prepare for the creation of a common economic space intended to facilitate trade. From an economic point of view, eastern Ukraine inherits a significant portion of Soviet industry. Its soils are rich in coal and minerals, and its fertile lands make it one of the world's largest producers of notably corn, potatoes, wheat, and sunflower seeds. On its side, the Russian economy largely depends on its hydrocarbon exports. The country alone supplies nearly half of the gas consumed in Europe via a network of pipelines that mostly pass through Ukraine. In 2004 in Ukraine, the second round of the presidential elections pits Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western supporter, against Viktor Yanukovych, who is pro-Russian. The latter wins, but with strong suspicions of electoral fraud. Massive demonstrations then erupt in Kyiv, and the country's Supreme Court invalidates the result and orders new elections. This time, Yushchenko wins. He then invites a pro-Western policy by moving closer to the European Union and NATO. In response, Russia plays the gas card and begins the construction of a pipeline in the Baltic Sea, allowing Europe to be supplied while bypassing Ukraine, thus reducing the income generated by the transit tax. Moreover, after a disagreement over a gas debt, the Russian company Gazprom ends the preferential rate that Ukraine had enjoyed until then. In April 2008, NATO announces that Ukraine and Georgia will one day be members of the organization, but not immediately, as many countries still oppose it, not wanting to offend Russia or to encourage the two states to implement reforms. During the next winter, after failed negotiations on the gas price, Gazprom cuts its deliveries to Ukraine, impacting the supply in Eastern Europe. Becoming very unpopular, Viktor Yushchenko announces that if he is re-elected, he will end the agreement allowing Russia to use the port of Sevastopol. Finally, the second round of the 2010 elections is between Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych, who wins. Yanukovych reinstates a pro-Russian policy. He extends by 25 years, thus until 2042, the agreement allowing Russia to use the port of Sevastopol. He signs a free trade agreement with 6 other former USSR countries. He adopts a law that allows regions, here called Oblasts, to officially recognize a minority language when it is spoken by more than 10% of the population, which mainly benefits the significant Russian-speaking minority living mainly in the east and south of the country. Then, at the end of 2013, Yanukovych announces that he will not sign an association agreement with the European Union that had been negotiated by his predecessor. In Kyiv, this decision triggers a massive demonstration that quickly degenerates into an uprising. After the death of about 100 people, Yanukovych flees the capital. The Ukrainian parliament, called the Rada, then decides that he is no longer fulfilling his functions and dismisses him. The next day, the Rada votes to repeal the law on minority languages. Although it has not been promulgated by the new power, this provokes the anger of Russian-speaking populations who organize anti-Maidan demonstrations throughout the country. In the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, where the population is predominantly Russian-speaking, unidentified armed men, who Vladimir Putin will later acknowledge as Russian soldiers, seize the parliament and the airport of Simferopol. In less than a month, the independence of the Republic of Crimea is proclaimed, and a contested referendum is organized, during which 96.77% of voters express support for joining Russia. Putin then annexes the territory, a move which is widely condemned by the international community. The European Union and the United States impose initial economic sanctions on Russia, and the country is removed from the G8, which becomes the G7. On its side, Ukraine mobilizes its forces to regain control of the east of the country, where pro-Russian revolts turn into armed insurrection. On April 7, 2014, pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk proclaimed the Donetsk People's Republic and announced the upcoming holding of a referendum. The first clashes then erupt between the Ukrainian army and separatist forces. On April 27th, the Luhansk People's Republic is proclaimed in turn. In Odessa, violent clashes occur between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian supporters. On May 2nd, a Russian-speaking group is targeted and takes refuge in the trade union's house. A fire breaks out there, killing 48 people. To this day, no one has been convicted in this case. The following month, Petro Poroshenko largely wins the presidential election in the first round and relaunches a pro-Western policy. In the east, the country's army gradually regains the upper hand, but more and more Russian soldiers cross the border to reinforce the separatists. Russia initially denies being involved, then speaks of volunteers on leave. In any case, a large counteroffensive is launched towards Mariupol, undermining Ukrainian forces. After negotiations, a ceasefire is signed, but this fragile truce does not last long, and fighting resumes, notably around the strategic Donetsk International Airport. A new ceasefire is then signed, this time with the support of France and Germany. This one is better respected, and despite numerous incidents, the front line no longer evolves. If the front is frozen, tension continues to rise between Ukraine and Russia. On one side, the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union comes into effect. On the other, Russia begins the construction of two new pipelines, one that crosses the Black Sea to supply Europe via Turkey, and another that runs alongside Nord Stream 1 to double the supply to Germany. The country also finalizes the construction of the Crimean Bridge, which connects Russia to the peninsula. If this new passage is very strategic for Russia, it is also so for Ukraine, which must cross the Kerch Strait to export its goods from the port of Mariupol. Since 2003, the two countries have an agreement on free navigation in the Sea of Azov, but Russia now wants to control maritime traffic. In November 2018, as three Ukrainian military ships approach the strait, Russia blocks the passage of the Crimean Bridge with a cargo ship, then captures the ships, accusing them of illegally entering its territorial waters. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky wins the presidential election, notably on a promise to end the conflict. He moves closer to Putin and manages to recover the 3 military ships. At the same time, he maintains the pro-Western policy and tries to obtain Ukraine's membership in NATO. This, for Putin, constitutes a red line not to be crossed. He deploys troops all along the Ukrainian border, then asks NATO to refuse Ukraine and to stop its expansion to the east. NATO responds that a sovereign state can freely choose to join or not the organization. A few days later, Russia sends 30,000 troops to Belarus, officially to conduct joint military exercises there. In total, about 190,000 Russian soldiers are then massed all around Ukraine. On February 21, 2022, Putin delivers a long speech in which he presents his vision of history. He considers Ukraine as historically part of Russian land. He therefore reproaches Vladimir Lenin for having recognized in 1922 the Ukrainian Socialist Republic and for having granted it too much autonomy, decentralizing power. He also criticizes the fact that the USSR gave Ukraine Polish, Hungarian, and Romanian territories during World War II. Then, in 1954, it offered Crimea. After the fall of the USSR, which he calls the catastrophe, he reproaches Ukraine for turning away from its common history with Russia to move closer to the West, and more notably to NATO, which, according to him, forms a threat to Russia by dangerously approaching its borders. Moreover, he accuses Ukraine of being poorly governed, of being plagued by corruption and the far right, and in his words, of organizing the genocide of Russian-speaking populations. That is why he concludes his speech by officially recognizing the 2 separatist republics, with which he signs a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance, allowing him to send troops there. 3 days later, on the morning of February 24th, 2022, Putin delivers a new speech in which he launches what he calls a special military operation, officially intended to disarm and denazify Ukraine. He calls on the Ukrainian army not to resist and threatens any foreign element that wishes to interfere. Here's what was most likely Russia's initial plan in Ukraine. The offensive would be launched on 4 simultaneous fronts, one in the south from Crimea towards Kherson, Mykolaiv, then Odessa, another from the separatist republics, one from Belgorod towards Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, and finally a 4th from Belarus towards Kyiv. Here, the plan would be to take control of the sky and to seize the Hostomel Airport as quickly as possible to establish an air bridge there. Russian forces would then begin the siege of Kyiv, and dozens of Russian and Chechen mercenaries would enter the capital to assassinate Zelensky. A pro-Russian power would then be put at the head of the country, which would become officially neutral and entirely disarmed. Russia would then obtain recognition of the annexation of Crimea, probably also of the republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and in its best-case scenario, it would take control of all the territories that the separatists call Novorossiya, reaching Transnistria, a pro-Russian separatist territory located in Moldova. This plan was supposed to be completed within a few days. On the morning of February 24th, just minutes after Putin's speech, Russia bombs Ukraine's strategic and military installations. 4 offensives are then launched simultaneously. In the north, around 30 Russian helicopters cross the border over the Dnipro River, then turn towards Hostomel Airport. On site, Ukrainian soldiers have parked trucks on the runway to prevent its use. Upon arrival, they manage to shoot down a helicopter that, by crashing, creates a new obstacle on the runway. After 2 hours of fighting, elite Russian units take control of the airport. But during their retreat, the Ukrainians fire on the runway, rendering it unusable. The 10 or so Russian transport planes en route, with 1,000 to 2,000 soldiers and military equipment, must abort their mission. The Russians who control Hostomel can now only rely on a military column that set out early in the morning, but it advances slowly along the only road linking Chernobyl to Ivankiv, as the bridges have been destroyed. Finally, the column arrives the next morning, and fighting begins on the outskirts of Kyiv. Elsewhere in the country, large cities are under siege, while in the south, Russian troops advance towards Mykolaiv. Internationally, the attack is widely condemned. The West targets the Russian economy by imposing numerous sanctions. The assets of Russian banks and oligarchs are frozen. The Nord Stream 2 project, which had just been completed, is abandoned. Most of Europe, the United States, and Canada close their airspace to Russian airlines. Meanwhile, Japan and South Korea suspend exports of strategic materials to Russia, notably semiconductors. At the same time, Ukraine's application for European Union membership is fast-tracked, and Zelensky requests that NATO impose a no-fly zone over the country. But the organization refuses, fearing escalation into a nuclear war, especially since Putin regularly brandishes the nuclear threat and obtains authorization from his ally Belarus to deploy nuclear weapons on its territory. In Ukraine, Russia targets communication infrastructure. Elon Musk then makes his Starlink satellite network available to the country, which ensures reliable communications. In Russia, anti-war protests are suppressed, and a new law imposes up to 15 years in prison for publishing information deemed false. Many Western media outlets then close their offices, while in Europe, major Russian media are banned. In the south, Russian forces seize Melitopol, Kherson, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. In Kyiv, however, they are held back outside the city, while a massive supply convoy, more than 60 kilometers long, becomes stuck further north. Having committed most of its troops, and as Putin has pledged not to mobilize, Russia begins recruiting foreign volunteers, notably in Syria, and turns to mercenaries from the private military company Wagner, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a former close associate of Putin. In the south, the Russian fleet bombards Mariupol from the Sea of Azov. Ukrainian forces counterattack in the port of Berdyansk and manage to sink a major warship. After a month of fighting, as the special operation slowly turns into a war of attrition, Russia changes strategy and halts offensives in Kyiv and Chernihiv to focus its forces in the Donbas. After its retreat, Ukrainians discover that the population of Bucha has suffered a massacre. Russia denies involvement, initially claiming a staged event, then blames the Ukrainians. A few days later, Putin awards an honorary title to the Russian brigade accused of committing the massacre. The front reorganizes in the east of the country. The Russians are pushed back from Kharkiv, but manage to take full control of Mariupol. Further north, Ukrainian troops defending Lysychansk must retreat to avoid encirclement, thereby losing total control of Luhansk Oblast. The Ukrainians set up a stronger defensive line around Bakhmut, while Russia announces a pause to rebuild its forces. The country then begins begins recruiting volunteers, offering highly attractive salaries of up to $6,000 per month, 5 times the national average. Meanwhile, the Wagner Group starts recruiting in prisons, promising freedom to inmates in exchange for 6 months of service. On the front, as Ukrainian ammunition supplies are nearly depleted, the country receives its first shipments of Western weapons, allowing it to launch a counteroffensive towards Kherson. Russia then concentrates its forces in the region, enabling the Ukrainians to initiate a second counteroffensive in the north, where they recapture just over 10,000 square kilometers in 1 week. Under pressure, Putin is this time forced to order a partial military mobilization, aiming to add 300,000 reservists to the front. In response, hundreds of thousands of Russians flee the country to avoid combat. According to official Russian figures, up to this point, 2.5 million Ukrainian civilians have been evacuated to Russia, including 412,000 children. Putin then signs decrees to facilitate the adoption of Ukrainian children without parental protection and to grant them Russian citizenship. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, 19,500 children are reported missing. This policy of displacement and Russification of the population will lead the International Criminal Court to issue an arrest warrant against Putin. In the Oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, referendums are hastily organized for annexation by Russia. Moscow tries to legitimize the vote by inviting pro-Russian observers from 20 different countries. Unsurprisingly, the results are in favor of annexation, which is immediately formalized by Putin. In response, Ukraine reiterates its request to join NATO and launches sabotage operations targeting the Russian economy. After likely being involved in the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, the country damages the Crimean Bridge with a truck bomb. In retaliation, Russia heavily bombs major cities and Ukraine's energy infrastructure, now also using Iranian Shahed drones. Odessa and its port are regularly targeted to undermine grain exports. On 11th November, the last Russian troops leave Kherson and retreat to the other side of the Dnipro River. The front line stabilizes, with Russia controlling about 20% of Ukrainian territory. On the front, the fiercest fighting takes place in Bakhmut, where Wagner troops attempt to take the city. Prigozhin implements his so-called meat grinder strategy, which consists of sending successive waves of soldiers, knowing that most will not return. But after several months of brutal fighting and the loss of 20,000 men, mostly prisoners, he publicly accuses the regular Russian army's high command of wanting to destroy Wagner. At the end of May 2023, he finally captures Bakhmut, which is left in ruins. A few days later, Ukraine launches a new counteroffensive with the probable objective of reaching the Sea of Azov and thus cutting the Russian-held territory in two. But this time, the front line is much better fortified, with trenches dug on both sides and minefields, making any offensive far more complicated. At the same time, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu orders Russian volunteers to join the regular army, which also affects Wagner's troops. Outraged, Prigozhin calls on his forces to overthrow the Russian Ministry of Defense. He seizes the headquarters in Rostov-on-Don without a fight and sends his troops towards Moscow. Putin denounces this as treason and promises a harsh response. After mediation by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, Prigozhin halts his troops about 300 kilometers from the capital. It is then agreed that Wagner Wagner fighters can either join the Russian army, retire, or follow Prigozhin to Belarus. On 23 August, the latter dies in the explosion of a private jet flying from Moscow to St. Petersburg. In the south, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is abandoned after its failure. The front is now frozen, and any new offensive comes at the cost of heavy casualties. Russia continues its bombardments while concentrating its offensives in the Donetsk Oblast. On the other side, Ukraine now focuses on solid defense to limit losses while using FPV drones loaded with explosives to strike Russian forces. These small civilian drones, worth only a few €100, can destroy heavy equipment worth millions. In the Black Sea as well, Ukrainian naval drones inflict major damage on the fleet in Sevastopol, forcing Russia to reposition its ships further east. Ukraine also uses long-range drones to target refineries and fuel depots deeper and deeper into Russian territory. Furthermore, for the first time, Ukraine is authorized to use certain weapons supplied by its Western allies against targets on Russian territory. On the 6th of August, 2024, the country launches a surprise offensive in Russia's Kursk Oblast. The main objective is to relieve pressure on the Donbas front by forcing Russia to redeploy part of its forces. Additionally, controlling Russian territory would be an important asset for Ukraine in future negotiations. In a somewhat difficult spot, Putin calls up 133,000 additional men for military service and receives at least 10,000 soldiers from North Korea who are sent to the front lines. On the 1st of January 2025, Ukraine does not renew the commercial agreement for gas delivery to Europe. Now the country counts on liquefied gas deliveries, notably from U.S. ships in Greek ports, where it is then regasified and distributed through the European network. Donald Trump's return to power changes the game. Very quickly, he shows that his main interest is economic. He halts military aid to Ukraine and organizes a first meeting with Russian representatives in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, without inviting Ukraine or Europe. Putin then states that he is ready to collaborate with American companies to exploit the country's rare earth elements, including in the territories annexed from Ukraine. Trump, for his part, puts pressure on Zelensky to obtain a deal on the exploitation of Ukraine's mineral resources in exchange for the military and economic aid provided so far. Zelensky replies that he primarily seeks security guarantees. Trump then proposes to take control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, claiming that this would deter a new Russian offensive. But Zelensky refuses, stating that he will not cede any territory. At the same time, Russia intensifies its counteroffensive in Kursk and regains full control of the Oblast. Meanwhile, as Trump threatens the entire world with increased tariffs, fears of an economic slowdown cause oil prices to drop, severely impacting the Russian economy, which still heavily depends on hydrocarbon sales. At the time of finalizing this text, no ceasefire agreement has been reached, and therefore no direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations have begun. However, here are the main demands of each side. Russia wants, above all, international recognition of the annexation of Crimea and the 4 oblasts it occupies. The country wants to block any future NATO membership for Ukraine, place limits on the country's future military buildup, buildup and replace its government. Ukraine, for its part, wants the withdrawal of Russian troops without ceding any territory. The country then seeks solid security guarantees, either through NATO membership or through the deployment of foreign troops on its soil. The United States, for its part, wants above all to obtain economic advantages in the region, whether through the exploitation of minerals, control of nuclear power plants, or the future reconstruction of the 200,000 buildings destroyed or damaged for a total estimated cost of around 500 billion euros. Trump appears willing not to integrate Ukraine into NATO and is reportedly considering recognizing the annexation of Crimea by Russia. After more than 3 years of war, the human and economic toll is heavy on both sides. On the Russian side, although there is no official number, it is estimated that between 100,000 and 250,000 soldiers have been killed on the front, with probably 700,000 wounded. The country's economy is weakened, but is maintained mainly through wartime production and hydrocarbon sales to India and China, with a new pipeline to China being planned. Furthermore, Russia has set up a so-called shadow fleet operated by companies registered in Dubai and sailing under flags of convenience, meaning via countries with lax regulation. This fleet is responsible for discreetly selling Russian oil, sometimes directly from ship to ship in the open sea. Lastly, Russia taps into its sovereign wealth fund to balance its budget and continue financing the war. On the Ukrainian side, according to official figures, since the start of the war, 46,000 soldiers are reported killed and another 380,000 wounded. The UN estimates that a quarter of the country's population is currently displaced or in exile, which represents about 10 million Ukrainians, most of whom are now in Europe. From a geopolitical perspective, Ukraine is more than ever oriented towards the West. Negotiations are currently underway for its accession into the European Union, while NATO membership appears unlikely. However, the war has accelerated NATO's expansion, with Sweden and Finland, once neutral countries, now having joined the alliance.